We're working. So I'm employed by both Tufts University, which is in the Boston area in Massachusetts, and Washington State University, Vancouver, which is much closer to all of you. So due to the travel restrictions, I am in Massachusetts for the time being, but behind me is my beautiful field site in Johnson Prairie that I will be talking to you about today. So just broadly to begin, we all know that we're living in a changing world, whether that be warming where you are or in the Pacific Northwest. They're predicting changes in precipitation as well as some warming. And in this changing world, we're concerned about what's happening to the insects. And so there was a review that came out quite some time ago now, almost 2 decades ago, talking about how temperature is identified as the dominant abiotic factor that directly affects herbivorous insects. And as we all know, our butterflies begin as caterpillars, which are herbivorous insects. So since then, many different studies have come out looking at these local adaptations of insects to temperature or upper lethal temperature limits. So what can our insects actually withstand? But it's actually more complicated than just temperature, especially if you live in the Pacific Northwest. Like I said, you have a lot of precipitation. So someone was joking about how the butterflies were all doing so well in this recent rainstorm, and we know that's not actually true, right? If you're going out to look for butterflies in a rainstorm, you're not going to be able to find them. So it's more complicated than thermal limits. In addition to changes in precipitation, there's changes in severity and frequency of disturbances in general. So increases in wildfires are predicted, as well as storms in general, drought, all these things affect caterpillars and butterflies. So here we have the Fender's blue butterfly, which you may have heard of. It's an endangered butterfly in Oregon, so just a bit south of all of you in Washington, in the Willamette Valley. And this butterfly lives in fire-adapted prairies, and so disturbance in the form of fire is actually a beneficial disturbance. So for example, the caterpillars, the Fender's blue caterpillars that live in these prairies post-fire, so here we have burned prairie larval survival versus unburned parts of the prairie larval survival, they actually do better if the prairie has been burned. And this seems slightly counterintuitive when you think about it, because burning probably isn't good necessarily for the caterpillars. If it gets too hot, it could be lethal to the caterpillars. But it turns out this larval survival is greater in the burned area where the caterpillars are also tended by ants more often. And so not only is this disturbance possibly beneficial to larval survival, but it's possibly beneficial to the species that are interacting with this caterpillar. And so we have these indirect effects when we're thinking about species interactions. So when we're thinking about how insects are going to react to this changing environment, it's really important to also think about how the species they're interacting with are also reacting to the changing environment, so everything can run smoothly. And when we think about butterfly conservation in general, we often think about conserving the butterfly's host plant, right? So host plants are really important. It's where the butterflies lay their eggs, it's where their young develop, and they're even more important for those host plant specialists, like a lot of the blue butterflies are. So here we have the large blue butterfly. It's native to the UK. And its host plant is in the thyme genus. And back in the 1950s, they started monitoring these butterflies in the UK. And once they realized these butterfly populations were declining, so you can see this here in this graph, they managed the thyme plant or the host plant by fencing off a bunch of different natural areas. And the thought was, if we fence off these natural areas, well, people aren't going to be trampling these important host plants, and large herbivores such as deer aren't going to be eating these important host plants. So they did a great job at conserving the host plant, but unfortunately by 1979, the butterfly was locally extinct in the UK, even though they had conserved the host plant. And what they found out when they dug deeper into this butterfly's biology is that as a caterpillar, it interacts very specifically with one species of ant. And this one species of ant, when the time is right, it crawls up out of the ground, responds to some kind of signal from the caterpillar, and it actually carries the caterpillar down into its colony, where the caterpillar continues developing, it pupates, and then emerges as a butterfly. And so without this one species of ant, this butterfly was unable to survive. And it just so happened that the way they managed the vegetation for the host plant was actually detrimental to this ant species. So they took the fences down, they let things naturalize, and the ant came back. And what they did was they took large blue butterflies from Sweden, which they're also native to Sweden, and they released some in the UK in these restored sites, and the butterfly was able to recolonize these sites. So here, these bees, they represent the introduction of butterflies from Sweden and the UK, and where we have Cs, that's natural recolonization of the UK butterflies. And so just by restoring this ant community, they were able to bring the large blue butterfly back. So beyond the host plant, there are other species that are interacting with these butterflies. So my goal is to determine how disturbance affects species interactions of the at-risk Puget blue butterfly. And one of the reasons we are studying the Puget blue butterfly is because it's part of a subspecies complex with the Fender's blue, which I mentioned earlier. And the Fender's blue is endangered. So we have limitations regarding what we can actually do with it as far as experimental studies. Whereas the Puget blue, while it is at risk, it is not endangered, and we can do a little bit more experimentally with it, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So one of the reasons we picked this butterfly is to kind of see if we could use it for a bit of a proxy to understand a bit more about the Fender's blue and how we might be able to help conserve that one as well. So I'm going to talk to you today about how disturbance affects the host plants of the Puget blue butterfly, the butterflies themselves, and then the ants that they interact with as a caterpillar. So before we get into the actual data, a bit about the Puget blue life cycle. So Paulette mentioned I got my PhD studying honeybees. So I came into the butterfly world thinking that everything overwintered as a pupa, and I was extremely wrong. So the Puget blue, right now, the caterpillars are in their 4th and 5th instar, and they're getting ready to pupate. So right now they're munching away on lupin. This is a host plant specialist. They lay their eggs on sickle-keeled lupin, or Lupinus albicollis, which is present on my field site, and I'll talk about that in a bit. They're munching away at lupin, and when and if they feel threatened, they will signal nearby ants for help, either via scent or sound. So the ant comes, it protects the caterpillar either by standing on top of it, circling around it, or just patrolling the area. And once the threat passes, the caterpillar, you'll have a chance to see this in a bigger picture later, but it exudes this little tiny sugar droplet as a thank you to the ants. And so as a reward, the ants get a little snack. So that's what's happening right now. They're getting tended by ants. They're about ready to pupate. In May and June, they will emerge as adults, and they will mate, and they will interact with nectar plants, which I've done some work on, but I won't be talking about too much today. The females lay eggs on the underside of lupin leaves. So here we have a beautiful white Puget blue egg. A couple weeks or a week later, the egg will hatch, and we have our first instar and second instar larvae, which are also interacting with ants. So just as a comparison for size, this is the same species of ant in both pictures, and you can see how big that caterpillar gets between second instar in June and July, and then we got 4th and 5th instar in April. When it becomes second instar, the caterpillar actually dons what we call its diapause color. So it turns bright from its bright green to kind of a brownish color. It drops to the ground from the plant that it's been eating on, and then it diapauses as a second instar larvae. So when I started with this system, I was pretty in awe that they diapause as such teeny little caterpillars, and then they reemerge the following spring. So today I'll be talking to you about the ants that caterpillars interact with during their later larval development, as well as where they're laying their eggs. So my field site is Johnson Prairie in Thurston County, Washington. It's a beautiful prairie on JBLM land. And we use this site because, as far as we know, it is one of the bigger populations of Puget blue butterflies. They are at risk. And so there aren't a ton of populations of them that have enough butterflies for us to study. So this is one of the bigger ones. And just to orient you to the state of Washington, here we have Thurston County, and that black dot is where Johnson Prairie is. So a bit south of where we would have been tonight in Seattle. In the fall of 2017, 1/3 of Johnson Prairie was burned in an arson event. So you can see here this on the right side of the screen, the nice green looking area, that's where the burn went through. On the left side of the screen, you can see there's a lot of Scotch broom coming up and some grassy and thatchy stuff. That's where the prairie was not burned. So when this wildfire came through Johnson Prairie, I just want to remind you, it was in the fall, so our Puget blue caterpillars were tiny larvae underground diapausing. And so presumably this fire wasn't very good for them because we're not sure how deep they can go into the soil. And we use this wildfire event as our natural disturbance. So burning tends to have a negative connotation. Wildfires are usually not good because they're hard to control. However, it is a natural disturbance, and it has historically been used to manage the prairies in the Pacific Northwest. So the South Puget Sound prairies have historically been maintained by both natural and anthropogenic fire. So Native Americans, here we have a land use map down at the bottom. The Puget Sound Salish managed these South Puget Sound prairies via fire. And fire was really important, as we've learned in the past 200 years when we've suppressed the fire, because without fire, there's encroachment of trees and invasive species on these prairies where so many species are endemic. And so prairies are a really special, important habitat for a lot of things. So now we know how important fire is, and we know how to control it a little bit better. So prairies are managed via these prescribed burns. So this is actually a picture from a Joint Base Lewis McChord Prairie where they're doing a small prescribed burn. So we're using this wildfire as a natural experiment to see how burning might affect the Puget blue butterfly. So here's Johnson Prairie from an aerial view. It's surrounded by mainly Doug fir forest. And you can see in the shaded area, that's what was burned in the 2017 wildfire, and the unshaded area is what we're calling our unburned. And by unburned, I just mean, as far as we know, was not burned since 2016. Because this prairie is managed via prescribed burns, there are different patchworks of burn histories on the prairie. And what we did is we set out 24 different experimental plots on this prairie. So each square here is a plot that's 25 by 25 meters. And we set out these plots in clusters that I call the north, the middle, and the south of the prairie, just to control for different variation along the prairie. And each cluster has 4 burned plots and 4 matched unburned plots. And these plots were matched based on the lupin density, because we want to study how this butterfly is interacting with its host plant. So we're interested specifically in lupin. So these are all medium to high density plots of lupin. And in these plots, we tracked different things depending on what we're measuring. So we did the plants, the butterflies, and the ants, and I'll get more into detail for each one I talk about. So before I get into burning in host plants, there'll be a few times where I stop during this talk, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning. So this is one of those times, and during those times, Paulette will be looking for questions. So I forgot to tell you this, but questions will be fielded by Paulette through the chat feature. So if you have questions as they come up, send them to Paulette via the chat. During the talk, I will be taking 3 questions, up to 3 questions at each pause, and then I'll take some more questions at the end as time allows. Since I forgot to mention this, do we have any questions now, Paulette, or are people still thinking?
There we go. We don't have any questions at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so burning and the sickle-keeled lupin, or the Puget blue host plants. So within these 25 by 25 meter plots, we did bi-weekly measures of host plant size, the number of flowering racemes. So here on this lupin, this stalk here, that's what we call a raceme. So we counted the number of those racemes in flower. And on the final week, we counted the number of racemes with seed pods. So here is Hannah, my Tufts undergraduate, who has been my intern since 2018. And we measured the size of the lupin using a very fancy meter stick here to get length, width, and height of the plant. We counted, again, the number of racemes in flower and the number of racemes that have seed pods. And what seed pods are really measuring is, was this plant well pollinated? Because without pollinators, like this bumblebee here, the plant wouldn't be able to make those seed pods. So this is the lupin size in burned and unburned areas of the prairie. So this is mean volume of the plant and the week that we were measuring the plant for. Excuse me. And this is the flight season of the Puget blue butterfly. And if you look at that orange line, or that top line, that's the burned areas of the prairie. And you can see that lupin plants in the burned areas of the prairie grew bigger, faster than lupin plants in the unburned areas of the prairie. So presumably, especially during this butterfly flight season, so during weeks 4 and 6, when we have a lot of females out and about laying eggs, there are more leaves for Puget blue butterflies to lay their eggs on in that burned area. When we're looking at the number of flowering racemes, we see a bit of a different pattern here in that, again, we have week on the x-axis and the mean number of racemes in flower on the y-axis. And there's similar numbers of racemes in flower every week except week 4 during that Puget blue flight season. And that's actually the peak of the Puget blue flight season. So during that time, there are more lupin flowers, and if Puget blues are nectaring on lupin flowers, that's a whole nother story, but if they are nectaring on them, there's more nectar in the burned area of the prairie than the unburned area of the prairie. So again, it's looking like the burned area has better plants. And I forgot to mention, for all of this host plant data, we didn't find a difference in location on the prairie, so no difference in the north, middle, and south. So this is all lumped together for those locations. We'll talk more about the locations when we get to the ants. And now when we look at seed pods, so again, this was just 1 week. It was the last week of data collection. The mean number of racemes in seed, which is shown by the left y-axis and those black points, was higher in the burned area than the unburned area. And the colored dots show you that there's a lot of variation in our raw data, or just the number of racemes in seed, which is your right y-axis. So again, in that burned area of the prairie, the lupin plants are being more being pollinated more successfully. And just anecdotally, walking around the prairie, there are so many bumblebees covering these lupin plants, especially in the burned areas. Coming from the bee world originally, I absolutely love this time of year when the plants are literally just buzzing with bees. So in summary, for how burning affects these butterfly host plants, or the Puget blue host plants, there are more leaves during that peak flight season in the burned area. So again, more leaves for butterflies to lay their eggs on. There's more nectar in the burned area during that peak flight season. So again, presumably more nutrients for the adults. Adult butterflies need nectar to get energy to fly and lay eggs. And then lastly, there is higher pollination success in the burn. So these plants are more reproductively fit in the burned area of the prairie. So overall, as far as humans are concerned, or I'm concerned, it looks like burning is really good for this Puget blue host plant. And it makes sense because a lot of these plants in the prairie are fire adapted because historically they have been. Okay, so now we've made it to the burning and butterflies section. And before I go on, are there a few questions, Paulette?
Yes, there are a couple questions. One is about whether the larvae burrow on their own underground or whether they're transported by ants.
Oh, that's a fabulous question. We don't know. There's a lot we don't know about the Puget blue natural history. That was part of what my job is. But the soil on Johnson Prairie is relatively sandy. So it's possible that a caterpillar could make its way underground. I don't know how far, but it's also possible that it gets carried away by ants. And that's something that I'll talk a little bit about later, and we're investigating this year. Okay,
and a second question about whether the drop of sugar is the primary benefit to the ant throughout the different cycles and events. For example, when they're underground or when the ants are acting as rescuers.
Yeah, so in this system, or so a lot of lycaenids are tended by ants. In a system where the ant tending is happening above ground, that drop of sugar is the only real benefit to the ants. But when the butterflies get carried underground, this is often considered parasitism on the part of the butterfly or the caterpillar. So the large blues get carried underground, and they trick the ants basically into thinking they are a baby ant, which takes some energy and resources away from other real baby ants. And so the large blues are seen as a bit of a parasite from the point of view of the ants, but not so much that they're necessarily harming the ant colonies overall. These are large colonies of social insects. But yes, the primary benefit is that drop of sugar.
Okay, and a final question. What time of year do the prescribed burns occur?
So the prescribed burns tend to occur in August or September. So we had one just last year that happened in August. And I work with the staff to plan the prescribed burns where it will both help them as far as getting rid of invasive species on the prairie, but also help the butterfly. So you'll see in a little bit, I don't want to give you any spoilers, but they work with me to do prescribed burns where there aren't a lot of butterflies, basically. And so we have as little effect as possible on the butterfly community, but can still deal with those invasive plants. So Scotch broom is a pretty big problem on parts of the prairie, as well as some woody encroachment. So the prescribed burns happen in August, similar to when this wildfire happened in September, when the caterpillars are second instar larvae underground. Oh,
there we go.
Okay.
Is that the time at which they naturally occurred in the past, or do you know?
That's a great question. My guess is yes, mainly because this is when it's dry enough for things to ignite more naturally. So April is too wet for anything to naturally happen, generally speaking. This could change over time. May is a bit wet as well, and then things just get drier throughout the season. So my guess is July and August. That is when Johnson Prairie anyway just starts to get kind of brown and crispy everywhere. And so that's what would provide the fodder for the burn.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Yep. All right, now we will get into how burning affects where the butterflies are on the prairie and where they're laying their eggs. So in order to assess this part of the study, we searched lupin plants for Puget blue eggs. So here is a beautiful Puget blue egg. It's a little less than 1 millimeter in diameter. They're small, but they're relatively easy to find. It's just tedious because you have to look through the whole plant. But they're this beautiful bright white, so they're easy to spot. And one really cool thing about this system is you can easily tell if the egg is hatched or unhatched. So this is an unhatched egg. It's nice and round. And you can see the caterpillar's little head cap in there if you look closely. The hatched eggs are deflated and kind of look like a little donut. So we can track egg hatching as well, which is fun. We also searched the lupin plants for larvae, like this little 2 millimeter second instar caterpillar, as well as larval damage. So the caterpillars are actually harder to find than the eggs. Even though the eggs are smaller, they're much less camouflage than those caterpillars are. And so one of the ways we kind of use, one of the things we use as a proxy for caterpillar presence is damage. So this little, what we call window right here, is characteristic lycaenid caterpillar damage. So you can see where the caterpillar's little head cap was munching away in there. And so we're able to count the number of windows as a proxy for caterpillar activity. And Jason and June, who are 2 field techs that are local to Washington, are currently tracking larvae and larval damage in the field, even though I'm not able to be there. And then we also look at the adult butterflies and figure out where they are. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. So here we have the total number of eggs. Again, the colored dots is the raw data, and this black is our mean. And you can see that in the burned area of the prairie, there are much fewer eggs than in the unburned area of the prairie. So even though there are more host plant leaves to lay your eggs on, the Puget blues are not laying their eggs in the burned area of the prairie. And we have a couple ideas for why this might be. Female butterflies are very sensitive to the chemistry of the host plant. It's a way in which they can tell if this is a good plant for me to lay my egg on. And so one thing that could be detected differently between this burned and unburned area is plant age. So if you remember, the plants in the burned area of the prairie grew bigger faster, and so maybe they seem like older plants to female butterflies. We also know that herbivory affects chemistry in plants, so it could be that burning affects chemistry as well. The soil is going to be different, a different temperature, different nutrient content. I worked with an undergraduate at Evergreen State College last summer to get a protocol up and running to look at the differences in chemistry between these plants, but in burned and unburned areas. But unfortunately, we were only able to collect enough data to verify that the method worked, and not enough data to compare these 2 treatments. So that is a question we are continuing to hopefully explore. To look at where the butterflies are, we did distance sampling. So this is another aerial view of Johnson Prairie, and we have transects running east to west from the north of the prairie all the way down to the southernmost lupin in the prairie. And we just casually walked along these transects once a week, noting where we saw butterflies. Were they in the unburned area or the burned area and which transect they were on. So when we look at where we find the butterflies, this is the total number of butterflies observed. And you can see we saw many more butterflies in the unburned area than the burned area of the prairie. So not only are they laying more eggs there, that's just where they are for some reason. And one of the reasons we thought this might be is maybe they just can't disperse that far. So maybe the second instar larvae that are underground are getting killed off by this burn, and then when you emerge as an adult, when you emerge as a caterpillar, you kind of just hang out on your natal lupin plant. You drop to the ground, you pupate somewhere near your natal lupin plant, and then you don't go very far after that. So maybe it's just hard for them to recolonize. So to look at the dispersal capability of these butterflies, we did a mark recapture study in 2019, and I'm going to show you a map with all the captures of the butterflies, and the recaptures will be connected by a line. And you can see by how long these lines are between our transect 2 and transect 22 down here, that these butterflies are not dispersal limited. So they can go from the unburned area to the burned area quite easily. They're just not for some reason. So you can see, especially these male butterflies have these really long paths. So they're not limited by dispersal. They are mostly found in the northern area of the prairie. So here we have the northernmost transect, transect 2, down to our southernmost transect, transect 26. Here's the prairie to remind you where those are. And most of our butterflies are found in these northern transects, with the exception of transect 18, which is just this beautiful, lush lupin area. So this is one of the things that I've worked with Joint Base Lewis McChord on as far as burning parts of the prairie. So they did do some burns in the south last year because that's where a lot of the Scotch broom is, but they were able to exclude a lot of this transect 18 where we see a lot of those butterflies, which is really great. So they've been great to work with as far as helping get rid of some of the invasives while also helping the butterfly. So as far as burning and the butterflies go, we found that more eggs were laid in the unburned area of the prairie, even though there are more leaves to lay your eggs on in the burned area. More butterflies are found in the unburned area of the prairie, again, even though you have more leaves to lay your eggs on, and possibly more nectar from those lupin flowers in the burned area. And we found more butterflies in the north of the prairie. So there seems to be something different in the north versus the south. And I wouldn't say it's lupin density. Lupin density is patchy in some areas of the prairie, but it's there in the whole prairie. So there's something else differing between this north and south of the prairie. Before I transition into ants, do we have any questions?
Yes, there is a question about the time of the burning. Comment that most management agencies are really more focused on safety and risk than they are on invertebrate management strategies, and wondering if there might be different strategies for management success. For example, dogs have been used to, Chris comments that dogs have been used to find the frass of other butterfly larvae. And do you think that might work for such a small larvae?
I don't know, but that's a fantastic idea. These caterpillars are really hard to find. We have found in 3 years of working with them now, I think a total of 8 wild caterpillars. They're quite cryptic. And so that is super interesting, even if we could get some idea of their density within the landscape by looking for frass. I love that idea, but I'm not sure if it would work for these guys.
Okay, there's another question about, well, let's see, Chris is following up on saying that teams have been training dogs to identify or to locate a fritillary in Oregon. So just for your information.
Super cool.
And another question about whether the ants are actually killed in the burned areas. Do you know what happens to the ants? Or maybe you're getting to that in the next section.
Yes, we will be talking about that in the next section.
Okay, so Al is saying dogs were used to detect the host plant of the Fender's blue, not the larvae. Oh, okay. I didn't know that dogs were used in that way. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. I do know in the Fender's blue system, the host plant is also threatened. So there's another layer to that. So maybe finding those host plants was once difficult. That's interesting. I had no idea.
Let's get on to hearing about the ants then.
All right, so burning an ant. So here's this bigger picture I was talking to you about of this caterpillar with the sugar droplet that it's giving up to the ant. And you can see the ant's little mandibles sucking up that sugar droplet. So to assess the ant community on Johnson Prairie, so this is a big unknown. We had no idea which ants were actually part of this community on the prairie. And we have no idea which ants actually tend to these caterpillars. So not only are we assessing how burning affects the ants on the prairie, but we're really just interested in identifying what's the ant community look like, and what ants are tending our caterpillars. Because in the case of the large blue, there was that one species of ant important to caterpillar survival, but in a lot of different systems, they're a generalist myrmecophile, and so they can be tended by any type of ant. So we have our plots again. In these same plots, we had pitfall traps, which is just a little container flush with the ground with some liquid in it. So anything that is ground foraging will fall into this trap. So we caught a lot of different invertebrates, including ants, a lot of spiders, some wasps, all kinds of different things, ground beetles, as you might imagine. But we filtered out just the ants. So I'm just going to talk about the ants today. So we filtered out the ants and identified them. These are some of the ant species we found on Johnson Prairie. Another thing I was naive about when I started this postdoc is the general diversity and shape of ants. So even their faces look very different here. Their bodies are all very different. You see, the little kid drawings of ants that are just 3 little circles, and ants are so much more complicated than that. So these are our ant species, and I'm going to point out a couple of them. The first is this Polyergus mexicanus. That's also known as the pirate ant, and it has these really specialized jaws. They're sickle-shaped, specifically for stealing young from other ant colonies. So these guys or girls, they're social insects, so the workers are all female. They can't actually raise their own young, and so what they do is they steal old young from other colonies, which then emerge and become their worker ants. So that's why they're called the pirate ant. They steal from other colonies. So I was excited about this one because it's got really cool biology, but also because I was told I was not going to find that ant on Johnson Prairie. And I did, so that was exciting. I also want to point out our dominant ant species. In the top right over there, we have Formica obscuripes. Its common name is the western thatch ant. It has these characteristic above ground thatched mounds as its entrance to its colonies. And these guys make really large super colonies that are all connected and interrelated. And then the other dominant ant we had on the prairie was Tapenoma seseli, which is also known as the odorous house ant. So if you ever see little black ants in your house, that's Tapenoma seseli. Their common name is odorous house ant because if you squish them, they have a citronella scent to them. And that's one of the ways we can identify them in the field. But in addition to those guys, we have all these cool species of ants on the prairie. So this is the first time we're actually characterizing the Johnson Prairie ant community. And we found that there was an interaction of burn location on the prairie and treatment. So I'll walk you through this graph. We have Shannon diversity, which is just a biologist's measure of the diversity of ants on the prairie. So a higher Shannon diversity you have, the more diverse an ant community is. And we have our burned plots in this kind of dashed line and our unburned plots in the solid line. So in the north and the middle, you can see there tends to be higher diversity in the burned plots. However, this wasn't a significant difference between burned and unburned when we did the stats. So you see with the north and the middle there, these are outliers in the data. So there are quite a few outliers. When we look at the south, however, there is a significant difference. So the burned areas or the burned plots had a higher diversity of the ant community than the unburned plots. And so we're seeing an effect of burn, but what we're seeing even more strongly with the ant community is an effect of location on the prairie. And we also see that the dominant species of ants differs with the location. So this is the proportion of pitfall traps with ants of each species. So this is a relative abundance plot. Each color is a different species that we found on the prairie. And again, we have burned and unburned areas. And this kind of purplish blue, that's Taponoma seseli. So in the north, in the middle parts of the prairie, Taponoma seseli is our dominant ant. Things look a lot different when we look at the structure of the ant community in the south. Now we have a switch where this kind of teal color, that's Formica obscuripes, that western thatch ant. In the greenish color, we have another Formica subenescens. And so our dominant species are different depending where you are in the prairie. So we have our odorous house ant in the north and the middle, and our western thatch ant and Formica subenescens, which does not have a nice common name, as our dominant ants in the south. And I just want to remind you that we found most of our butterflies in the northern part of the prairie. And so one thing that could possibly be happening, and we don't have any data on this, is maybe the butterflies not only are able to detect plant chemistry, but some kind of signature of what the ant community looks like on the prairie, or if Taponoma seseli, that odorous house ant, might be a really good tender, is around. So maybe the butterflies hang out where the good ant tenders are. In the silvery blue butterfly system, which is a closely related, not part of the subspecies complex, but another lycaenid butterfly that is also ant-tended as a caterpillar, they actually found that the thatch ant, that Formica obscuripes, is not a good tender. So there were these studies done in Colorado where the silvery blue is also native, and they found that caterpillars that were tended by the western thatch ant actually were lighter as pre-pupa than caterpillars that were untended by ants. And so one of their conclusions or hypotheses was that these western thatch ants are almost milking the caterpillar. So instead of protecting it, they know the caterpillar is a source of food, and they kind of hang out until they get that sugar droplet. So that could be the case with our Puget blue butterflies. Maybe the adults are avoiding laying their eggs where those bad tenders could be. So we know how burning affects the ant community, but one of the things we were also interested in is how burning might affect ant tending behavior of these ants and the Puget blue caterpillar. And like I already said, these caterpillars are really hard to find on the prairie. So unfortunately, we weren't able to find enough caterpillars to actually look at who's tending the caterpillars. But we do have ants that are likely attendants of these caterpillars. So Formica obscuripes and Taponoma seseli, anecdotally, we've seen them tending our caterpillars. So I've shown you pictures of Taponoma seseli tending these caterpillars. And in the Fender's blue system, that closely related Oregon butterfly, Formica subenescens and Formica lasioides are also tenders. So we have ants that are known to interact with a closely related lycaenid, but we don't have any good sample sizes of data. So regarding burning in the ants, community is affected by the burn, but even more strongly than that burning is the different dominant ants within the prairie. So we see that community is affected by burn, but different communities are affected more strongly by the burn. So that southern part of the prairie was affected more strongly by the burn. And I think this is because that western thatch ant, like I said, is known for its conspicuous mounds above the ground. And after the burn, we literally see craters where those mounds were. And so the ants' activity is really changed between burned and unburned parts of the prairie, whereas the more subterranean ants probably aren't as affected as much and can burrow underground to avoid the burn. And then the effect of burning and ant tending, we don't have any data on this, but we do have some predictions based on what we've seen in the Fender's blue system. So all the way at the beginning, I told you that burning actually increased ant tending and as well as larval survival. So that's could be happening or could happen in the Puget blue system. And also with the Fender's blue, Cameron Thomas, a grad student from Washington State, found that when there is thatch on the ground, the ants are recruited more slowly. So in the unburned areas of the prairie where it's more thatchy, the ants might take longer to come to the caterpillar's rescue than in that burned area of the prairie. So before I summarize conclusions and talk a little bit about what's happening now, do we have any questions, Paulette?
Yes, you have several questions. The first is a general question about whether the blues typically have some sort of association with ants.
A large proportion of the blues do have some kind of association with ants. Some are obligate, which means they have to be tended by ants, like that large blue butterfly. Some are facultative, which I think is more the case with the Puget blues, where tending can help them, but it's not necessarily needed. And some are generalists, and they can be tended by all different types of ants, and some are specialists. So it's pretty common in this family of butterflies.
Okay, there's another question about the pirate ants. Specifically, why aren't they able to raise their own young? It seems like a curious situation.
Yeah, so those jaws that they've evolved are not gentle enough for larvae when they're young, but they are gentle enough for pre-pupae and pupa. And so they can't actually pick up their own babies, basically, with those jaws that they have. So they can only pick up those older young, and then they emerge, and then they take care of all the babies. I'm not sure how it started, but...
Who takes care of the baby pirate ants then?
So workers of other species. So what they do is they will raid, like pirates, an ant colony of another species, and sometimes they prefer certain species over others. And they'll take their pre-pupa and their pupa and bring them back to their colony. And when those pre-pupa and pupa emerge, those are then the workers that take care of these pirate ants' young offspring.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Another question is about the source of information on the ant communities and whether any of the species are introduced species.
That is a great question. I'm pretty sure Polyerus mexicanus, that pirate ant, is an introduced species from either further south or Mexico. It is a Mexican population, Mexican subspecies of a different species. Most of them are native, if I'm remembering correctly. I am working on publishing the paper of the ant community, so I will definitely share it with you guys. But antweb.org and antwiki.org are really great, well-curated sites where you can just type in an ant species name and it brings up their range, their native range, their introduced range, and a bit about their biology, as well as pictures of the specimen. And those are two sites that I've used to identify these ants and learn more about them, because there's really not a ton on prairie ants in the Pacific Northwest yet.
Okay, there's another question about several people are finding this extremely interesting and wondering if you might be able, as a follow-up, to provide some recommendations for reading further.
Yeah. So Nomi Pierce, she's a professor at Harvard University. She wrote a whole review on the ecology and evolution of these lycaenid butterflies. It's pretty dense. It's about 40 pages long, but there's definitely bits of it that you can skip over, like the phylogeny and the taxonomy and all the systematics. And there's a lot of really cool behavior stuff in there. So I'm happy to share that with Paulette to share with the group, as well as a couple other resources on just these more mechaphilous or ant-loving caterpillars in general.
Okay, that sounds great. Are there any other questions that people have? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you so much, Rachel.
All right. Well, I wanted to give you a little summary and tell you a little bit real quick about what we're doing right now. So just overall, in the burned area of the prairie, the plants seem to like it better. So there are more leaves, there's more flowers, there's more seed pods. In the unburned area of the prairie, however, that's where we find all of the butterflies. Well, not all of the butterflies, but most of the butterflies and where they lay their eggs. And coincidentally, we have the dominant ant in the north is Taponoma seseli, where we find most of the butterflies, and the dominant ant in the south is Formica obscuripes, where we don't find as many butterflies. So what's happening right now, as I said, I'm not able to be in the field due to current travel restrictions, but two Washington State University field techs, Jason and June, are working to collect some data on ant tending with caterpillars that we reared in the greenhouse. So this is one of the things you cannot do with Fender's blue butterflies, but you can do with Puget blue butterflies. Last summer, we caught female butterflies, had them lay eggs on lupin plants and raised their eggs in the greenhouse to those second instar larvae. And we put those larvae in diapause over the winter in the Washington State University greenhouse. And now they're fourth and fifth instar larvae. And Jason and June are putting them out in the field to look at what happens. So they're going to simulate a predator, which I'll show you a video for in my last slide, and observe which ants are actually tending these caterpillars and what they actually do. So we have no idea what behaviors these ants might exhibit when tending Puget blues because no one has really watched this in a systematic way. They could pick them up and carry them to their nests, which would be super awesome. So I dream, when I do fieldwork, I dream about my fieldwork. And one of the dreams I had was that we discovered a new behavior that I called squishing, which is the ant goes up to the caterpillar and gently squishes it until the sugar droplet comes out. That's what I named it in my dream. Who knows if June and Jason will see it in the field. So this is a lot of fun because the way you simulate a predator is you find a caterpillar. So here we have a silvery blue caterpillar. You pick a blade of grass and you gently poke the caterpillar. So you'll see a blade of grass come in here on the video. The caterpillar gets poked. We already had some ants tending this caterpillar anyway. But you can see, if you look closely, down here at the bottom, the caterpillar's tentacular organs are going in and out really fast. And those are the organs that are putting out that chemical signal and calling the ants for help. So you can simulate a predator and actually see if the caterpillar is kind of aggravated by your predator simulation. All right, and with that, I want to say thank you to all of you for having me, for inviting me to be there physically, but for accommodating me virtually. This has been a lot of fun, as well as a learning experience for a lot of us, I think, and to everyone who helped make this research possible. And if there are any remaining questions, I could take a couple more, Paula, if you got any new ones.